So I think we'll go ahead and start just because we have quite a tight schedule today. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Jamil Arts Center and the second day of the Shifting Arts Symposium. My name is Dawn Ross, and I'm head of collections at Art Jamil, and I also curate the Artist Garden Commissions program, alongside my colleague Nadine El-Khoury, who is the assistant curator at Art Jamil. So thank you to everyone who attended the symposium yesterday. And for some of you coming back today, it's really great to see you, as well as there's some new faces in the audience. So thank you very much for being here. I'd also like to say thank you to the speakers for the incredible talks yesterday. I mean, there were some interesting discussions, lots of energy, and so much engagement and discussions and questions from the audience. So really excited to see how the talks unfold today. So there'll be two panels today, each running for about 2.5 hours, with a short break in between each panel. So the first speakers will be Jonathon Miller Weisberger, ethnobotanist and author based in Costa Rica, Asuncion Molinas Gordo, artist and researcher based in Spain, Soledad Gutierrez, chief curator and executive producer of TBA 21 on St. Age, also based in Spain. The second panel will include Dr. Eloisa Martin, Associate Professor of Sociology based in the UAE, and artist Nala Taba, also based in the UAE. So we'll continue on from the discussions yesterday that focused on agriculture and ethnobotany of the region. However, also kind of introduced a bit of an international perspective. For the first panel, we'll shift our focus away from the UAE and the Arabian Peninsula and look at traditional and indigenous practices in South America and Spain. And then for the second panel, we'll come back to the UAE, looking at Emirati food culture with Dr. Eloisa Martin, finishing the day with a presentation on a new Jamil Arts Center project called Shamsa by Nala Taba. So just to reiterate from yesterday, there's also a film program that runs alongside the symposium. This is on level 2 in Gallery 9. So if you do have time during today or the break, please do pop up and have a look. So I'd like to introduce the first panel, which is called The Deep Memory of the Earth. This panel will explore issues impacting on the environment, plants, and communities due to climate change, loss of biodiversity, as well as deforestation. It'll look at the relationship between plants and the environment and the traditional and indigenous people and practices of the Amazon and Spain. The first presentation is by Jonathon Miller Weisberger. He will discuss his book, Rainforest Medicine, Preserving Indigenous Science and Biodiversity in the Upper Amazon. And he'll also be discussing his research and experience with the Waorani people and his work on the demarcation of their territory, ethnobotany, and mythology. So we had hoped that Jonathon would be with us here today, but unfortunately we're going to be live streaming him in. So you'll be seeing him on the screen. So this is Jonathon, and he will be our first speaker, so I'd like to formally introduce him, and hopefully you can hear him okay. And I will hand over to Jonathon to start his talk.
Thank you also very much. Thank you for the organizers of the Jamil Arts Center who brought this amazing conference together. My name is Jonathon Miller Weisberger, and I was raised in the country of Ecuador. I was born in the United States, but raised in Ecuador. And between the years 1990 and 1994, I worked with the Waorani people. The Waorani are Ecuador's most recently contacted indigenous group, and there are still several non-contacted groups, which is the most appropriate use or description for these types of people are people who live in voluntary isolation. Of course, 40 minutes is a short amount of time to speak about the Waorani. So I will try my best to share just a little bit of my experience, a little bit about an overview of who the Waorani are, and then I would like to share with you a legend that is a Waorani myth the legend of the Great Flood, of the Omporemona, the hero twins, we could say, or the grandchildren of grandmother and grandfather creator, and how they created a new time for humanity to live in peace. The Waorani are an ethnic minority. They number approximately 1,200, maybe 1,400 individuals. Fascinating about the Waorani is that their language has no linguistic affiliation to any other language on the earth. I'm an ethnobotanist, but some of the information I share with you also comes from information gathered by a friend of mine. Her name is Laura Rival. She edited the chapter in my book about the Waorani. Laura Rival is a French anthropologist, and quite possibly the definitive anthropologist who has the most insight and authentic wisdom about the Waorani people. Some of her books are Trekking Through History by Laura Rival about the Waorani. And the Waorani are very highly misunderstood people, mainly because they speared their way into history first in the 50s, late 50s, when they speared 5 Summer Language Institute missionaries from the United States. And then later in 1986, they speared 2 Archbishop Labaca and a nun, Madre Ines. And so that's attracted a lot of different, ideologies about who they are and what they're, but I got to know them for who they really are, and I found them to be very, very remarkable people. And fascinating about the Waorani is that Laura Rival says that in a traditional Waorani culture, or way of life, they would not know more than 70 people in their entire lives. So they lived in extremely remote wilderness areas, highly autonomous, such to the extent that by the age 11, each Waorani was pretty much considered to be completely self-sufficient. To ask for help from anybody is compromising their spiritual immortality. And the Waoranis do not believe in death, and they believe that death is caused by the malice of another individual, another person. And so at the turn of the century, when the rubber tappers started pushing their way closer to and shrinking, many illnesses came even without contact. It was like a mist that followed the rubber tappers. And so many Waoranis started to die from illnesses, from causes that they had no idea of. In a very traditional Waorani culture, when someone was old and they couldn't be independent anymore, they would just go out to the forest and ask to be speared to death by their own family. So it's a way of life. The topic for this panel, Deep Memory of the Earth, definitely is very appropriate for the Waorani. And the Waorani, when they chose to reject everything, but when they realized that they couldn't reject everything anymore, they chose to accept everything, which to me was very, very challenging to see, because the Amazon and their territory is basically now been encroached upon by we could say the worst of the Western world, peak industrial extractivism from the oil companies, logging, colonization, prostitution. So but they're so pure in their stance that when they saw they couldn't reject everything, then they basically accepted everything. And so now things are leveling out a bit more. Waoranis are getting educated in schools, and there's a lot of young leaders and very important leaders too in the Waorani way of life. And it's amazing because most Westerners, we can't live in the forest as smoothly as they can. But they're very adaptable. They can live in the forest, and when they come out to the town, they're very adaptable in the town too. So it's quite remarkable to see like a human culture that's formed just pretty much by the influences of nature, sort of like the weathered lines on the desert, after a wind has blown over it, or, the rocks on the banks of a river. Their way of life hasn't been formed by the influence of other human cultures. I was able to work with the Waorani between 1990 and 1994 on the physical demarcation of their lands. My friend, an Australian member who was able to forge a contract with the Ecuadorian government, and we took on the project of accomplishing the physical demarcation. We were actually introduced to the Waorani by Laura Rival, the French anthropologist who I mentioned. And there's a quote from Laura Rival that I put in my book that I always really liked. And basically it says that the Waorani would spend the great majority of their life patiently and calmly observing nature. They're profound ecologists, one of the few indigenous groups that actually recognize the difference between pollination and dispersal. They have names for absolutely everything. So for sure, they're, rainforest scientists, the indigenous science of the Waorani. And the project that accomplished the demarcation of their homelands was a very profound experience, very eye-opening experience, to go down into the end of these very deep oil roads and to help them to basically now make known where the new limits of their territory were, because the Waorani received 670,000 hectares, which is about 2 million acres of land from the Ecuadorian government in the 1990s, which is 1/3 of their ancestral territory. So the demarcation project helped them to now know where the new limits of their territory are. And they, I personally oversaw the relocation of 30 colonist settlers. I was the youngest one in the group, but I spoke the best Spanish, so I became the tip of the spear, kind of saying, oversaw a lot of negotiations and dialogues that succeeded in relocating these 30 colonist families that were inside the territory. They were actually Shuar Indians. I'm not going to go too into the whole dynamic of colonization and the situations in the Upper Amazon, because I'll never get to the point of what I really want to share, which is just an insight into the beauty of the Waorani. As you can see from the slides, very, very beautiful images that are very moving. I would like to share a gratitude to all the different photographers. I hadn't had the time to organize and track down and give the appropriate photo credits on the images, but most of them I just took off the internet because my hard drive had died on my computer, and so I didn't have access to my photo archive. And so I chose some old photos. You can see, kind of how the Waorani have changed their appearance over time, and so, but I think for educational purposes, that's perfectly fine to use these images. The Waorani have a story that I learned, and because I recorded hundreds of hours of recordings with the different elders. They're very outspoken people, and so it wasn't difficult to have them contribute words about their way of life that I was able to record. And I could see, one could reckon they're a very shamanic society in the sense that, well, they don't use any of the entheogens that are currently used and practiced amongst many other indigenous groups in the Upper Amazon, but they have stories and knowledge about them, which I found fascinating, that they don't use them, but they have amazing stories about them. But it's like they read your mind, like they know what's going on, and they just go along with whatever you're going along with. I found that to be very kind of startling in a way. It makes you wonder, like that if privacy is actually just a hallucination of the modern mind. And I had a little apartment in the town of Baños, and I wasn't working anymore with Waorani. In 1996, I began working with the Sequoia people. My book, Rainforest Medicine, is an overview of 3 indigenous groups: the Sequoia, the Quichua, and the Waorani. We're related to Chapter 8, which is about the Napo Galeras isolated limestone massif, which is a sacred mountain with apocalyptic connotations. And so it's really about like the indigenous sciences, rainforest conservation, examples of the life of the elders, and the universal culture of service. But at the time, I had a little apartment in the town of Baños. And every time I'd come back from the Sequoia territory in the northern Ecuadorian Amazon to my apartment in Baños, this young Waorani friend of mine, Niwa, would just show up. And for them to get there, he just had to like hop a little plane. Sometimes planes go into their villages. Most of the Waorani villages are huddled around airstrips now. And it's a huge fascination when an airplane comes in, Ebu, they call them. They just drop whatever they're doing and run to see the plane land. And he would hop a plane and then take a bus up to Baños. But it was really amazing how every time I'd come back, he'd just be there at the same time. And he'd just like, I knew you would be coming back to your house. I'd come to visit. So I'd have him sit down and start interpreting and transcribing all the audio recordings that I had. So I was able to acquire some fascinating information, and that's how I obtained this legend. As far as I know, it's not been published anywhere. I give some insights into it, but I don't share the whole legend in my book. And it's the legend of the Omporemona. Ompore means the river otters. And so the giant Amazonian river otter is the main form that the grandchildren of grandmother and grandfather creator take in the myth. But they're also able to transform into woodpeckers and into people. And the legend says that long ago, the people had swayed from the original instructions that were given to them on how they were to live their life by Meme Wengongi and Beba Wenkantoki, grandfather and grandmother creator. People had begun to become corrupted, and all the different kinds of perversions, I guess we could say much like we see happening today, became prevalent among the people. And so grandfather creator got disturbed by this and chose to clean the earth with a great flood. In many regards, it's similar, this story, to different aspects of the Bible story of Noah, of the great flood and Noah's Ark. And so grandfather creator came to a family of Waorani that were living according to the original instructions of an upright, integral way of life. And he said to them, I'm going to bring the great flood to cleanse the earth of the corruption. And so he instructed them to hollow out, and you can see a slide of the Jakarta tree. It's a tree it's a papaya relative, and so it has a very soft pith. The internal part of the tree can be easily hollowed out. And he instructed them to hollow out the pith of this tree and to make 2 boards on sides where they would cover with beeswax. And when they heard the great floods coming, to hide in there with all their plants so that they could save themselves. Sure enough, grandfather creator came, and the images of grandfather creator walking down the river valley, stomping his feet on his arms. And you can see the photo of the Ewengono flower, the Ruellia chartesi flower. He wore on his arms, tied these flowers. I think that's also important, shows the indigenous symbology of colors. And just an interjection, I read that the Maya from Central America, they valued the Quetzal feathers more than gold and jade. And it was mainly because of the color, the iridescent green color. So the indigenous people are, they're a very symbolic culture. And so we could reckon that red is the color that symbolizes heaven, because grandfather creator wore the red flowers on his arms. And behind them came roaring the floods, just ripping through the landscape, just washing everything away. You can see a photo of the gourd tree, the Crescentia crujete tree, that an individual thought that if he tied himself when he heard the floods coming to this tree, that he would be saved, because has a very strong roots and doesn't get ripped out when there's floods. Later, they say, the legend says, they found his arm, only his arm tied to the tree. His whole body was yanked off. So these Waoranis, the family that they went into the boat, and then sure enough, the water came and it lifted the boat downriver. And some time passed, and the boat settled onto the sandbanks, and they felt that it didn't move anymore in the water, and they could see the sunlight shining through the thin bark of the tree. And so they decided to open up, and they came out, and they were on the banks of a giant sandbank, and the legend says, and the sun was rising over the beautiful Degiwe tree, which is the Guayacan tree, the Tabebuia aurea. It's a very beautiful yellow flowering tree, and the sun was shining through the tree over a great body of water. So the Waorani living in the Western Amazon at the base of the Andes, maybe we could reckon that they ended up down at the mouth of the Amazon, down by the Atlantic Ocean, because the story says that they were over a great body of water. The sun rose. Well, the sun was shining. It was setting. The legend says the sun was setting, actually, excuse me, over the great body. Oh, no, it was rising. Okay, that's right. The sun was rising. The Atlantic Ocean would be in the east. Okay, so the sun was rising over and shining through the tree. And then these river otters came to them and said to them, they spoke in their language. They said, "Why does the river smell so bad?" And the Waorani said, "It must be from all the Waoranis that were killed in the flood." And then so they went on their way, and then they went, and the river otters, they were the Omporemona, the grandchildren of grandfather and grandmother creator. So they thought to themselves, let's go visit our father, our grandfather. And so they went up to the tree, the yellow flowering tree, and they transformed into woodpeckers. First, they transformed into people, into Waorani, and they went and they obtained some vines, and they made a vine roll that they used to shimmy up the trees. And then as soon as they jumped onto the vines to climb up the tree, they both transformed into woodpeckers, and then they just climbed up as birds. And then when they were on the branches of the tree, the younger brother was the one who gave the instructions. He said to the older brother, okay, we're going to fly. And when we get to the edge of Grandfather Creator's home, we're going to fly like a dart. We're going to go right through the tree. We're going to tighten our bodies. We're going to burst right through the tree. And the younger brother said to the older brother, you fly through the chambita palm. You can see an image in the slide of the thorny palm, which is what the Waorani use for obtaining their fiber to weave their hammocks and string bags and fishing nets. And then the younger brother said, I will fly through the degiwe tree, the yellow flowering trumpet tree. And so they flew. And then the story says that the shape of the woodpecker has a very curved flight. They kind of flies, soars like this, like a kind of like the edge, like the bottom of a bowl that was turning upside down. And so behind them, the story shows that the land rose. The land rose. And they did this so that the people who survived the flood could have a hill to escape on if Grandfather Creator sent more water. And when they saw the trees at the threshold of the realms between the physical and spiritual realms, they tightened their body. I found an interesting photo there. You can see on the slide presentation of a woodpecker in flight. And they burst through the trees. And the moment they burst through the trees and they entered into the immortal realms where Grandfather Creator lives, transcendent of time and space, a loud thunderclap was heard. Boom! A loud clapping sound just reverberated through all space. There was a fish, the mud skipper fish, that can come in and out of the water. He heard the thunderclap. And he went down into the water where legend says Grandfather Creator was resting inside the water. There's such rich symbolism in these stories. And he woke Grandfather Creator. He said, Grandfather, your grandchildren have come. So grandchildren flew, still as woodpeckers, they flew around. They saw where Grandfather had his lake. And they flew down to his lake and they saw that he had a lever, this strange lever. And so they put a trap on the lever. And then they came as Waorani in the form of people. They came to Grandfather and Grandmother Creator's house. They said, Grandfather, we've come to visit. And so they arrived, and business as usual, they started living with them. And then they asked Grandfather, they said, Grandfather, what is that big lake that you have up there? How is it that you sent all the waters? We came because we were curious because all the earth is being flooded. We came to ask you what's going on. And he said, oh yes, the people, they've swayed from the original way of life, from an integral, upright way of life. So I'm cleaning the earth and of the people that are living harmfully, not according to my original instructions. And they said, Grandfather, how do you make the floods? Can you show us how you do it? And he said, yes, let's go, I'll show you. And so the legend says that he put the ewingono flower on, the red flower, the Ruellia chartaceae. He wrapped them on his arms and he went, he says, come, I'll show you how I make the floods happen. And so he got to the spot and he pulled his lever. But when he pulled his lever, he got shocked by lightning because grandchildren had put a trap on it. He was shot by electricity and he fell over and he fell into the water and he fell up confused and he says, that wasn't that way before. What's happening here? So he went back and he pulled it again. And he fell over again into the water, splashed into the water. And he went up and he pulled it again. And he fell back, splashing into the water. And the legend says he got caught in this cycle of confusion where he would go pull the lever, get shocked and fall into the water, pull the lever, get shocked. And during that time, the grandchildren built a big fire. And then they saw that he was just stuck there, getting shocked and falling into the water, confused, getting shocked. So they said, Grandfather, come, you're too feeble, you're too cold, let's go warm up by the fire. And they brought him over, he was hobbling, confused. Why is it doing that? It wasn't doing that before. And he went up and they got to the fire and they were warming up by the fire. And they built a fire like a big, like a circle. And inside, they would jump inside and jump out of the fire. And he said, Grandfather, jump inside the fire like we're doing so you can warm up. And he says, oh, I'm too weak. I can't jump into the fire. They said, you can do it. We can help you. And then both went in and both went out. We'll hold like this. He said, no, I can't. They grabbed by the arms. They jumped in. They left in the fire. They jumped out and they threw and they piled the fire on top of him. and his body swelled, grandfather's body swelled, and it burst. Boom! It burst open, and all the animals that exist in the forest, they say, came running out, and they grabbed everything. First jaguars, all the big animals came running out. They grabbed them, they killed them, and threw them into the fire. The tapir came running out. They killed the tapirs and threw them into the fire. The wild boar came running out. They killed it. Everything that came out of Grandfather Creator's body, they killed and threw into the fire. Until the end, of even small insects came out. They stomped them out, threw them into the fire. At the very end, a very small red mite came crawling out. They stomped it and threw it back into the fire, and they waited a good while, and nothing came out. And so they let the fire die. And then they returned to Grandmother Creator, and they said, Grandmother, after a while, said, "Where's Grandfather?" And they said, "Oh, he stayed back taking a pee," says the legend. And then after a while, she said, "Where's Grandfather? He's not coming." And they said, "Oh, Grandmother, we can't lie to you. We killed Grandfather. We burned him." She's like, "What? You burned Grandfather? How dare you? Why did you do that?" "We didn't want him to wipe out all the people. We wanted the people to have an opportunity." And they said, "But Grandfather, not to worry. Grandmother, not to worry. We're going to make a new Grandfather." She said, how are you going to make a new Grandfather?" She said, come. So they brought Grandmother to this place where the ashes were of Grandfather Creator. And they said, "Take some ashes and we'll put them in a funnel." You can see a photo of the funnel of how the Waorani make their arrow poisons. There's the two plants illustrated in slides, the onta and the guinea yankam, the Curarea tecunarum and the Petria minensis. These are two plants that, I'll just interject this aspect of Waorani culture. Later, when the Waoranis, were living in the forest, they saw that the snakes had poison and fangs to hunt with easily, and they saw that the jaguars have claws to hunt with, but they're living naked in the forest, and it's so difficult to survive. And so they thought about how the grandchildren, this legend, made a new Grandfather Creator, and then they noticed that there's a plant that none of the animals eat. So they thought, they were so ingenious that they recalculated, they used from their myth as if it were a science, and scraped the bark of this vine and percolated it through the funnel, and learned this way, discovered how to make their arrow poisons that they used to hunt with, from this legend that I'm sharing with you now. So Grandmother Creator took the ashes and they made it into a funnel, and they percolated water through. They put a pot at the bottom of the water, and then when the water came through the ashes of Grandfather Creator, they listened intently. And when the first drop came out, bloop, they heard a voice, and the voice said, "Before I thought less, bloop. Before I felt less, bloop. No, before I felt more, right? And then bloop. Now I think more, bloop. Now I think less." And they said, "Oh my God, now we're in trouble," they thought. Sure enough, the next morning in the pot, there was a baby. And they said, Grandmother, go down to the edge of the river and wash the baby." And so she went down to the edge of the river, and the grandchildren transformed into horseflies. They can also transform into horseflies. And they went when she was bathing the baby, and they stung her on the kidneys, and she screamed and dropped the baby and said, "Grandchildren, the baby's in the water." And then they jumped into the water in the form of river otters, and under the water they ate Grandfather Creator. And they came up just with an arm and with a leg. And Grandmother, outraged, "What are you doing? What have you done?" And they came back and they said, "No, Grandmother, that wasn't a good Grandfather Creator. We're going to make a new one. Let's go back to the ashes again." They went back to the ashes. And this time, Grandmother, because the first time she took the ashes from where his head fell. And they said, "This time, Grandmother, take the ashes from the center, from where the heart is." And she took the ashes from the heart, they made a leaf funnel, and she percolated the water through, and they listened intently. And when the water came through and dripped out, it said, the first drop came, bloop, and they said, "Before I thought more, bloop, now I think less, bloop. Before I felt less, bloop, the water, now I feel more." So now they were happy. Now Grandfather is going to think less and feel more. And so the next morning, in the water where it dropped, they covered it with a leaf. Sure enough, there was a little beautiful, robust baby rocking back and forth in the pot. "Grandmother, now drink milk." And they caught the catfish for Grandmother in the river, and they gave Grandmother to eat catfish so that she could produce a lot of milk. And baby raised baby was raised and grew very strong, grew very quickly. And with a matter of time, and it was already his full size again, just like the old original grandfather creator. And then grandmother was happy and says, "Oh, grandchildren, you've done good." And grandfather said, "Grandchildren, you've done good." And then the grandchildren said, "But grandfather creator, look at the earth. It's covered in mud. All the trees, just the tips of the trees are sticking out of the forest. They're all dead." And the grandfather said, "Grandchildren, you want to see the forest?" And grandchildren said, "Yes, we want to see the forest." And then the grandchildren said, "Tomorrow, when the sun rises, you'll see the forest." And that's why there's a photo there of the beautiful sun rising over the forest as an image with the mist rising. And sure enough, when the sun rose the next morning, legend says that all the forest was there intact, filled with birds and animals, and the mist rising, and the sun shone over the glory of the forest. And then so the grandchildren said, "Grandchildren, we're going back now." And the grandparents said, "Grandchildren, you have done good." And they jumped into the water. And the story says they rose up, and the grandmother and grandfather were on the banks of the river waving goodbye, saying, "Thank you, grandchildren, thank you." And they swam off in the form of the giant marauders. So that's the legend of the Great Flood. And the Waorani say that we're in the fourth phase of existence now, in the fourth world. Before that, there were two other apocalyptic phases of destruction. The earth was burned by fire, and the legend there is outlined in my book that it was caused by the mischievous Waorani who set the clouds on fire, wanted to see what happened because the earth, the clouds shimmered low over the earth, and the stars shimmered low over the earth. And there was a ladder. They say that the people can go up to their heavenly abode, or the origin place, the Namun Kapaweti, the cluster of stars where they believe they originally came from, and come down at free will. But when they set the clouds on fire out of curiosity, the heavens rained just pure fire, and only two Waorani families survived. One at the base of the sweet potato patch, the fire deflected over the sweet potatoes, and another at the under the ceiba tree, which is symbolic, I feel, of the sweet potatoes represent the harmony of the earth because they're golden colored and they live inside in the earth. And so the families that harmonized with the harmonizing energies of the earth were saved. And then the ceiba tree represents the tree of life, the union of the roots and the trunk, the unseen and the seen realities of existence as a unity. And those families were saved. Before that, there was a time of destruction where all the Waoranis were killed by one single spear, and with the arrival of the Nenkiwenga, the son of the sun. That's another very profound legend. So I'm going to share with you just a little bit now for the remaining of my talk about Waorani ethnobotany. And interesting enough, the Waoranis, they had very few illnesses because they were such a deep forest people. And so they have a very vast and profound knowledge of ecology, but they use very few medicinal plants. And mainly their plants relate to snake bite. They have very effective snake bite medicine. No one dies of snake bite in the Waorani territory. If someone were to die of snake bite, they consider it sorcery, and then the death has to be avenged. And they have remedies for like spear wounds. The Waoranis, before the turn of the century, they were very peaceful people. But because their territories were pushed closer together, many of the Waorani started dying from illnesses they had no understanding of, and they blamed it on their neighboring villages, and they would have to avenge the death. And so if someone were to die in a Waorani village, they'd go out and they'd kill the first person that they found. And they had the Waorani territory is insane, really, because the Yasuni National Park, the Piedmont area where they live, a botanist, a friend of mine, Dr. Walter Palacios, he's probably one of the most fine botanists, dendrologists on the planet. He wrote he's described over 300 new species of trees to science. He wrote the book of the Trees of Ecuador. He personally told me that in the Yasuni Piedmont area, he found a new species of cedar, not the Western cedar, but the Spanish cedar, the Cedrela odorata, the Meliaceae family relative. They found a new species of cedar tree, like every 30 meters. So basically, it's considered to be the origin location of where the evolution of the cedar that tree came from. And in 1 hectare of forest, you can find well over 400 species of trees per hectare. And it's just so diverse, the rainforest. So it's something we know so little of. We probably know more about the surface of the moon than the rainforest. Unfortunately, the forest in the upper Amazon is under great onslaught. There's been some victories too. The Waorani people won a lawsuit that released one of the oil fields from the concession, and so there's certain areas that are protected. There's the non-contacted clans that are still existent, that choose to live in voluntary isolation. They have received an intangible zone by the Ecuadorian government. I actually heard when that was first declared, there was a mass at the Catholic Church of the St. Francis Church in Quito. And the Archbishop came out of Quito, and I went to listen to this. I was fascinated that the church was endorsing the intangible zone. And the Archbishop of Quito basically pronounced to the people listening that they consider it a sin in the eyes of God if anyone were to try to attempt to contact these people. That when the day came that they chose to contact the outside world, then they should be received, but no one should go and ever contact them. And unfortunately, the intangible zone is not really where their territory is, and they're like migrating geese. These people, they don't know boundaries, so oftentimes they go out and they can't hear the sound of a chainsaw or a helicopter. It's synonymous to the apocalypse. They can't see. Their house cannot be seen. Laura Rival helped me to understand that for a Waorani, non-contacted Waorani, to have their house seen is synonymous to death, basically. So they always live in hiding under the canopy of the trees. The story of the Waorani is not really an agreeable story. It's very profound, very, very profound. We could say it's the tip of the spear, really. In the story of the Waorani is symbolic of what's happening on the earth today, of the crash course encounter between modernization and the wilderness. Many of the Waorani today, though, are still very happy people because they live very in the present. So they're not like traumatized about things that have happened yesterday. They're very, very in the now. That's an aspect of the Waorani way of life, very present. And so the Waorani are very joyous people, and they choose to live in joy. And they live very present, very, very fascinating way of life. It's really, really been a profound honor to know and be friends with the Waoranis. Their shamanism is very different than most other indigenous groups too. They use no entheogens. They don't drink alcoholic beverages. They don't use any of the hallucinogenic or entheogenic plants. They have a deity, an ancestral protector deity, the Menyedi Wempo, the grandmother or the father mother jaguar, because mother is Bada and father is Mempo. So the word Wempo means beyond gender, mother, father, the image of. So the Menyedi Wempo, the jaguar mother, father, comes to the different Waoranis at times, and they don't train for this. It's just the deity chooses a Waorani, and then they'll come to him, that person or her, into their heart. And then, because the Waorani, for example, when someone is sick, they don't have healers amongst their culture. If someone comes to the Menyedi Wempo, to the jaguar shaman, and says, "Oh, I'm sick, will you heal me?" They'll say, "You got yourself sick on your own, you heal yourself." Because if they heal that person, they admit that they caused the illness. And so what happens is that when the jaguar spirit comes to the body of the Menyedi Wempo, the Menyedi, then they go into a trance and they start chanting. And then all the villagers line up, and then they can fix babies that are wrong in the stomach. They can heal different things. They can give advice. They can, traditionally, that's how they protected such a huge territory, because a relatively small population living in millions and millions of acres of wilderness. The Menyedi Wempo would tell the Waorani where the Kowode come. The Kowode is the word for all the non-Waorani, but they also recognize Wabeka Waorani, which are, Waorani means people from another place, and Kowode. The Kowode are the cannibals, the race of people that abide to no moral order. And there's a legend too, and I have that in my book, about how the Kowode received that name because they ate their father. They killed and ate their father. So it's symbolic of, and it means like maggots. It means those who are cutting the world to pieces, those that abide to no moral order, those who ate their father. And they would go, because the Menede Wimple would tell them where the settlers were intruding, and they would go with all their might, naked in the forest, and they would basically, like the oil town of Coca, they would actually cross in the 1960s up to the 70s. They'd swim across the river on balsa rafts with a bunch of spears, wait at 3 a.m, just raid in, and they would just spear whoever they could, and they'd spear them up. They'd grab their guts and run off into the forest, rubbing their body in their guts, laughing. I don't know if that's a formula for not, attaining karma, but I think this story is very, very profound. And then they'd live in the wilderness for several weeks without just eating raw food, and they'd come back when it passed. Wepe, I'll leave this last story with you, and then before I close. Wepe, one of the oldest Waoranis, who killed Tonya, who was the first Waorani evangelist, he said that when he chose not to kill anyone anymore, he had to use all his power because he felt like there was a salt coming out of his mouth. His mouth started salivating, and he felt something yanked off his back. And he was free forevermore. Very happy old timer who lived to great age. He sat in his hammock for a whole month without eating any food before dying. And then laid down and was gone. My kind friends, thank you for your attention. I appreciate the interest. Profound gratitude to the Waorani people who have become my friends. Thank you for the organizers of this wonderful symposium. Thank you for all the listeners. I hope that this talk has been a significant contribution to this beautiful forum. Thank you. I see I have 5 more minutes. Let me share one more thing to leave it on a more interesting note, since I have 5 more minutes. 2 minutes, okay. One thing that fascinated me about the Waorani, well, 2 things. They said that, I asked Wepe, tell me about the Waorani. He said, the truth is like the tip of my spear. It goes through everything. And old Mingatu, he said to me, he said, the Waorani, they don't get used to anything. So, very free, very swirling society. One time we were walking through the forest, and this decrepit little funky butterfly at the last of its life, just with one raggedy, kind of half-broken wing, fluttered slowly down onto a very funky little decrepit flower. And old Wepe found this to be the funniest thing, and he was just dying laughing. And then I started laughing too. His laughter was contagious, and I started laughing. We both just laughed and laughed, and then we hobbled back to his hut, arm in arm, laughing. And it got me thinking. It was an empowerment. He taught me how to enjoy the simple things in life, to find the glory in the simple things in life. We live in an age where people don't feel satisfied anymore. They have to have the latest app, the latest this, the latest that. And we have to return to that way of life where we see the beauty in the simple things of life. And that is the main message of the Waoranis. They are the masters of simplicity. They enjoy and they see the authenticity, they see the beauty in the simplest of things. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathon, and for all those lovely stories.